What is the point of sending our children to school? If you put this question to the children themselves, they might very likely answer that there is no point. Unfortunately, considering the present state of our educational system, that is probably the right answer. And one child who never grew up, G.K. Chesterton, thought it was the right answer a long time ago. In his view, the purpose of compulsory education is to deprive the common people of their common sense. What common sense through the ages tells us is that most people have this simple, basic desire: to have a happy family and a happy home. Chesterton says that just now there's a tendency to forget that the school is only a preparation for the home, not the home a mere jumping-off place for the school. As is so often the case in the modern world, we have things exactly backwards. In the process of turning our children over to the public education system, we've turned our backs on the home and the family. We've somehow mislaid the primary purpose of going to school.
The one thing that is never taught by any chance in the atmosphere of public schools is this: that there is a whole truth of things, and that in knowing it and speaking it, we are happy.
According to Chesterton, the whole point of education is that it should give a person a set of standards, eternal standards, which can be used to judge fugitive standards. We have this backwards too. Our schools change their standards more often than they change the light bulbs. Chesterton says the modern mind cannot make up its mind. It has no eternal philosophy, no eternal reference point. But the irony is that the more doubtful we are about the value of philosophy, the more certain we are about the value of education, which is the same thing as saying that the more doubtful we are about whether we have any truth, the more certain we are, apparently, that we can teach it to our children. The smaller our faith in doctrine, the larger our faith in doctors.
It is the great paradox of the modern world that at the very time when the world decided that people should not be coerced about their form of religion, it also decided that they should be coerced about their form of education. I think our coercive popular education has been uncommonly near a complete failure. Every education teaches a philosophy, if not by dogma, then by suggestion, by implication, by atmosphere. Every part of that education has a connection with every other part. If it does not all combine to convey some general view of life, it is not an education at all. The truth is that the modern world has committed itself to two wholly different and inconsistent conceptions about education. It is always trying to expand the scope of education, and always trying to exclude from it all religion and philosophy. But this is sheer nonsense. You cannot have a system that claims to provide a complete education and then refuse to discuss theology.
Chesterton claims that the idea of infinite education arose among the wealthy classes, where it was natural enough for a fashionable lady to leave her little daughter to be taught by 5 different governesses, while that same fashionable lady was out demanding more rights for women. And it was that mentality, more or less, that became the basis for our modern public education, the idea of entrusting a child to specialists while the parents go off and do something else, which in most cases meant working in a factory. By turning public education over to the experts, we've undermined the natural authority of the family. Chesterton says the man in the street is wholly at the mercy of an academic priesthood. But there's a further problem with this system, because it does not have the same advantages that the fashionable lady had with her 5 governesses. As Chesterton points out, among poorer people there cannot be 5 teachers to 1 pupil. Generally, there are about 50 pupils to one teacher. There it is impossible to cut up the soul of a single child and distribute it among specialists. Instead, we tear in pieces the soul of a single school teacher and distribute it in rags and scraps to a whole mob of children.
In the case of comparative poverty, which is the common lot of mankind, we come back to a general parental responsibility, which is the common sense of mankind. And we also come back to the parent as the person in charge of education. If you exalt education, you must exalt the parental power with it. If you deprecate the parental power, you then must deprecate education with it. Private education rarely is universal. Public education can be comparatively narrow. The mother dealing with her own daughters in her own home, does literally have to deal with all sides of a single human soul.
Chesterton says the human house is a paradox, for it is larger inside than out. When we step out of the home, when we pass from private life to public life, we are passing from a greater work to a smaller one, from a harder work to an easier one. And that is why most modern people wish to pass from the great domestic task to the smaller and easier commercial one. They'd rather be in the business world serving the minor needs of 100 different people than meeting all the major needs of just one person, which includes serving meals, conversation, and moral support. They'd rather teach a course in trigonometry to 100 children than to struggle with the whole human character of one child. Chesterton says that anyone who makes himself responsible for one small baby as a whole will soon find that he's wrestling with gigantic angels and demons. While public education suffers from the conflicting problem of not enough teachers and yet too many specialists, the result is a lack of results. Children actually keep learning less and less. They cannot even get a basic education.
To say that the moderns are half-educated may be too complimentary. By half. I have nothing but general information, but it is very general. What surprises me in people younger, brighter, and more progressively educated than myself is that their general information is very sketchy.
The schools are painfully aware of the decline in education, and so they scramble to try new things, new theories, new ways to teach. Chesterton says that most educational theories are not as old as the children being taught. We're not educating students anymore, we're desperately educating the educators and giving them a group of students on which to experiment with the latest techniques of teaching. Chesterton says our schools are swept nowadays with wave after wave of scientific speculation, by fad after fad and fashion after fashion. There's an utter rejection of tradition, of the truths that built our civilization, the truths handed down through the generations. The prevailing ideas in modern education, from nursery school to graduate school, defy common sense and insult the common man. Worse still, they oppress the common man.
There are two ways of dealing with nonsense in this world. One way is to put nonsense in the right place, as when people put nonsense into nursery rhymes. The other is to put nonsense in the wrong place, as when they put it into educational addresses, psychological criticisms, and complaints about nursery rhymes.
What makes it even worse is that everyone knows that education is in serious disarray. Everyone's upset about the schools. But as Chesterton says, the people who try to escape from the system are found and punished. The people who cannot be found anywhere are those who are happy with the system.
It is rare to come across anyone enthusiastic about our system of elementary instruction. It is not common to find anyone who is even free from grave misgivings about it. Nobody seems very keen about education, least of all the educators. I have a huge personal respect for the teachers in the church and state schools in regard to their untiring cheerfulness, industry, and courage. But I never met one of them who seemed at all certain that the system was doing any good.
The basic cause of all the problems in modern education can be summarized in 3 words: Darwin, Marx, and Freud. The ideas of these 3 men have pervaded all of modern thought, and their theories are much alike. They are narrow, materialistic, fatalistic, and utterly anti-Christian. Their influence has been felt far beyond their limited fields. Darwin's ideas have contributed to a blind belief in progress. They've also served as a justification for cutthroat capitalism and the survival of the fittest mentality in our commercial and political relations. Marx's ideas plunged half the world into darkness for most of the last century, but in the other half of the world they've served as a justification for the extended growth of the state and the loss of the authority in the family and the centrality of the home. And Freud's ideas have led to an overemphasis on sex and have served as the justification for the normalizing of the abnormal and the pervasive decline in morality in our society. The academic community's utter sellout to these 3 figures has elevated science, economics, and psychology above religion. In fact, all of these 3 have been invoked to explain away religion. Chesterton says that the primary public duty before us today is not to educate the uneducated, but to uneducate the educated. We could start this process of bringing common sense back to education, by tossing out Darwin, Marx, and Freud and all their minions, or studying them solely for the purpose of finding out what the enemy is up to. Chesterton does not say that there's absolutely no truth in Darwin, Marx, and Freud. He says that the minor truths that they got hold of, they stated utterly and entirely out of proportion to 1,000 other truths.
Each of them took not so much a half-truth as 100th part of a truth, and then offered it not merely as something, but as everything. Having never done anything except split hairs, each of them hangs the whole world on a single hair, whether it be biology, economics, or psychology. It is yet another mark of this sort of agnostic that he is ready to assert his absolute knowledge of everything, to the verge of a contradiction in terms. Just as he will always try to write a history of prehistoric man, so he will always struggle to be conscious of his own unconsciousness. Just as it is the latest fad to prove that everything is sexual, so it was the last fad to prove that everything was economic. The Marxist notion, called the materialistic theory of history, had the same sort of stupid self-confidence in its very insufficient materialism. As the one fad conceives everything about the bird to be connected with mating, so the other conceived everything connected with it to consist of catching worms. These fads fade very fast, and it may seem hardly worthwhile to prick bubbles that will burst of themselves. Nevertheless, there is one consideration that makes it worthwhile. It is a character of all these manias that they cannot really convince the mind, but they do cloud it. Above all, they do darken it. All these tremendous and rather temporary discoveries have had the singular fascination that they were not merely degrading, but were also depressing. Each in turn leaves no trace on the true and serious conclusions of the world, but each in turn may leave very deep and disastrous wounds and dislocations in the mentality of the individual man.
Darwinism was embraced by its first great proponents, Thomas Huxley and Herbert Spencer, because they were agnostics, and they used Darwin to support their own skepticism about religion. Chesterton says it would have been better if they cultivated a little more agnosticism about Darwinism. The problem is not that they opened the evolutionary question, but that they closed it. Evolution is no longer a subject for debate.
The Darwinian will not condescend to argue with you. He will inform you of your ignorance. He will not enlighten your ignorance.
Chesterton points out any number of weaknesses in Darwin's theory, including the rather remarkable lack of fossil evidence. He says they continue to demonstrate the Darwinian theory from the geological record by means of all the fossils that ought to be found in it. And indeed, the gaping holes in the fossil record continue to be as problematic as they've always been. The missing link is still missing. Chesterton says, if there were a missing link in a real chain, it would not be called a chain at all. But the real problem with Darwinism has not been its implications for science, but its implications for everything else. Chesterton argues that Darwin's theory is directly related to the rise of industrialism in the 19th century and the massive human oppression that went along with it. It is largely responsible for our modern-day cult of progress, or what Chesterton calls the absurd necessity for maintaining that everything is always getting better. It has other implications as well.
The Declaration of Independence dogmatically bases all rights on the fact that God created all men equal. And it is right, for if they were not created equal, they were certainly evolved unequal. There is no basis for democracy except in a dogma about the divine origin of man.
Chesterton says that even if the evolutionary theory is true, it's totally useless for human affairs. It is enormous but irrelevant, like the solar system. It is a colossal trifle.
What I complain of is a vague popular philosophy which supposes itself to be scientific, when it's really nothing but a sort of new religion, and an uncommonly nasty one at that. When people talked about the fall of man, they knew they were talking about a mystery, a thing they didn't understand. Now they talk about the survival of the fittest. They think they do understand it, but they have no notion of what the words mean.
Chesterton says that where Darwinism failed as a true philosophy, it succeeded as a false religion. It has become ingrained into our thinking. And the problem is that instead of talking unphilosophically about philosophy, we now talk unscientifically about science. I want to make it clear that science itself is not the villain. Science, as Chesterton says, is either a tool or a toy. If we make it into something more than that, it has dire consequences for all the other phases of life. Putting science up on a pedestal and putting our trust in it, giving it a primary function instead of a secondary one, causes us to neglect our responsibilities and our moral and artistic standards and our ability to think for ourselves. We end up using our choices to lose our choices, to enslave ourselves, and then we put our hope in science to set us free. We expect science to take care of us, to watch over us, to make our future safe. We stand up and demand a cure for a disease when it is our own immoral behavior that has caused the epidemic. We try to cure every troublesome behavior with chemical concoctions rather than change that behavior by making good decisions. We ask science to control us instead of making a conscious effort to control ourselves. This is faith in the material to the utter neglect of the spiritual. And it is nothing less than idolatry, plain and simple. It's the most rampant and condemned sin of the Old Testament, creating and setting up our own ultimate authority, believing our own remarkable fabrications, bowing down to our own accomplishments, relying only on what we can see and touch. It is ironic that we've come to put all our faith in science and then claim to be autonomous and supreme. We have intoxicated ourselves with self-esteem. And at what cost? At the considerable cost of our souls. We've taken government and turned it into a surrogate parent, even a surrogate self, as we let regulation replace conscience. We've taken economics, which should be nothing more than a minor nuisance 3 times a day, and we've put it into an all-powerful, all-consuming force. We've put the comforts of the body above the care of the soul. And we've scorned religion as something backwards, even dangerous. And we proceed on the presumption that the answer to all our questions not only can be dug up with our own tools, but can be quantified and distributed within a system of our own making. But the system no longer serves us. We serve it. We have a few more minutes to dispense with Marx and Freud, which is actually more time than they deserve. While Marxism as a whole has been completely discredited after doing untold damage to the world, there remain elements of it that still have influence, such as the idea that everything can be explained in terms of economics, that the events of history are inevitable, and that the state is the absolute authority. In terms of education, it's this last one that is the most damaging, for with state-sponsored compulsory education, the state has used its power to replace the authority of religion and of the family and of individual conscience, which brings us to Freud.
The wild and credulous worship of psychology seems to be especially common in America. As we have seen a new republic of Russia founded entirely upon Marx, perhaps we may eventually see a new republic of America founded entirely upon Freud.
As with Darwin and Marx, the conjectures of Freud have passed from being a hypothesis and have hardened into a dogma. Chesterton says the student of Freud is forbidden to forget sex and will remember everything about the unconscious mind except that it is unconscious. It was Freud and his theory of psychoanalysis which led to the incredible rise of the counseling industry and psychological therapy. The worst part of this legacy is that it has replaced the confessional. So instead of finding forgiveness for our sins, sins which we committed through our own fault, we get the most amazing psychobabble wrapped in the mantle of science that explains that our sins are not sins, and whatever it was we did, it wasn't our fault. It was our parents' fault. It was our teacher's fault, or simply nature's fault. The evil perpetuated by this sort of counseling is twofold. We become less responsible for our sinful actions, even while we long for forgiveness that never comes. It is the marriage of Freud and Darwin, of one pseudoscience to another.
The eager use of scientific terms is but a part of our evasion of responsibility and our dark adoration of fate. The mere word science is already used as a sacred and mystical word in many matters of politics and ethics. It is already used vaguely to threaten the most vital traditions of civilization, the family and the freedom of the citizen.
And the word science is especially used to eliminate the supernatural. But Chesterton says, take away the supernatural and what remains is the unnatural. Darwin, Marx, and Freud. Each of them rejected Christianity. They gave us theories that have been used to promote some of history's most unnatural and degrading attacks against human dignity. If we want to rescue education and our society, we can start by kicking these three bad boys out of school and letting God back in. We need to take away the state's power and give it back to the parents. And we need to get rid of the fads and fashions in education and start teaching the permanent things. As Chesterton says, teach to the young men's enduring truths, and let the learned amuse themselves with their passing errors. I'm Dale Ahlquist. Please join us again for the Apostle of Common Sense.